Good morning, my friends. In the previous talk, Navigating Modern Theology 1, I wanted to use as an entry point a conversation between two great theologians, Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann. And what we'll discover is that the conversation is kind of between Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann and German liberal Protestant thinking and Roman Catholicism. Okay? Barth stands, in a sense, outside the sphere of everything that has occurred for the previous 1100 years before him. It's astonishing. Barth stands outside that sphere of this Western intellectual tradition that's going to begin with the Renaissance in the 11th and 12th centuries. When Islam introduces Aristotle into the Christian West, because the Christians don't have Aristotle's text, when that happens, it's a century later, Thomas Aquinas comes up with his massive Summa, which at that time was an incredible achievement. Thomas has mastered Western Christian theology and put it right here in his Summa. Of course, you know the story. At the end, he can't finish writing it. He has a vision of God, and he considers everything he's written to be dust. Thomists, of course, don't, and they study him. But from that point on, reason and revelation are going to be connected. And it's always ever going to be a conversation about what's the relationship between the two. That's it. That's all philosophy is asking from the 12th century, and that's all theology is asking from the 12th century. And what's the relationship between reason and revelation? What's perhaps more fascinating, I'm tutoring a student right now in late medieval intellectual history, and we're using Stephen Osment's The Age of Reform, one of my favorite texts. To use, to read again, to dip in and out of. I love this book. And what's really remarkable is when you go to the table of contents of the book, and he's about to describe the 12th century and the three major issues that have to be grappled with. These are the three subsections. Now, please excuse the older gender thing here, and if you're politically correct, well, get pissed off and get over it. Chapter 2 is titled The Scholastic Traditions. The first heading in this chapter is called How Man is Saved. The second one is How Man Truly Knows. And the third is What Scripture Means. In other words, how are we saved? How do we know anything? And how do we interpret the Bible? Are we not in the same place in the 21st century, right here, now, today? Are these not the three big issues? They're the same issues because it's the same fundamental issue that's never been dealt with until Karl Barth. And Barth took the conversation in an entirely different direction, saw something that others since the early church had not seen, and particularly Thomas Torrance in his work makes the argument that Karl Barth, Albert Einstein, and Athanasius all share the same epistemology or way of knowing how we know what we know. They share the same one, and it's an interesting thesis of Torrance's, but nevertheless, the point is you see Barth breaking with this model that's been around for 1,000 years, since the 11th, 12th centuries, the beginning of the Renaissance, and the rise of the universities, starting in the 12th century with the University of Paris, the emerging in the centuries to follow kind of merchant class, okay, and as trade is just flourishing in Europe. And then, of course, there's the Black Death and the decimation. I believe Europe loses almost a third of its population and then springs back, and you have the Reformation and everything that follows. Point is, this issue of reason and revelation was never solved. I don't know that Barth solves it. I really don't. I really think you have to bring Girard into the mix to solve it. That's what my PhD thesis is all about. It's called Religion and Revelation and the Thought of Karl Barth and René Girard. But when you are just stuck dealing with this issue, you have to remember you can only deal with it from one of two sides, reason or revelation. You can't deal with it together. You have to start somewhere. So of course, Christians are going to start with revelation, or what they think is revelation, what they call it, their doctrines, their system of thought. That's what they call revelation, and they can call it the Bible, they can call it theory of inspiration, they can call it anything they want. But they believe they're starting on the side of revelation, okay? And then over on the other side, you've got everybody that says, okay, we're just going to use our reason. And we know here in the 21st century, or let's just go back, as Bultmann put it in the 1940s and 50s, you know, we know there's no such thing as miracles. Miracles don't happen. We have the absolute shift to modern medical thinking. We have telephones, you know. Things like this just don't happen. And so what we need to do is we need to come to these texts with our reason and recognize that they talk in a language that's true to them. And we need to find out what their message is so we can make it true to ourselves. And so we demythologize the New Testament. We look at its worldview, strip out the supernatural, we're left with the anthropological, and then for Bultmann, Heidegger comes into play here, and we interpret the anthropology of the New Testament. Not incorrect moves. They're not incorrect moves. Demythologizing is essential. It's the problem is what, as we'll talk about in a minute, is what the object of Bultmann's demythologization was versus, for example, Girard's. Okay? Different objects are in view. Now, with this business of the discourse on this reason and revelation, I want to take you back for just a moment because I need you to understand this big shift that's going to occur just before, during, and after the First World War in the 20th century. It's absolutely essential you understand this, okay? At the turn of the 20th century, if you are looking at the same notes I'm looking at, you're not going to get this because I'm ad-libbing here. At the turn of the 20th century, there were basically two major centers of theological thinking, one on the continent in Germany and over in England, Cambridge and Oxford in particular. You did have in the United States Yale, Harvard, Princeton as centers of quality theological thinking. Most seminaries at this point are still embedded in denominational thought. I mean, they continue to be, obviously, but they will also be influenced down the road by the emerging historical critical method, which has not even hit the States yet. And at this time also, the liberal Christianity has, or I should say non-evangelical Christianity, you know, the congregational churches, the United Churches of Christ, these sorts of denominations have been impacted by Rauschenbusch's emphasis on the social gospel, that is, that the gospel's lived and acted. In scholarship in Germany at this time, will occur a shift with two books. The first is Johannes Weiss's Jesus Proclamation of the Kingdom of God. Okay? The second is Albert Schweitzer's Quest to the Historical Jesus. These are the two books that are going to absolutely shift everything, and give us what we have today. It's kind of amazing when you think about this. You know, you have this slim little volume, Jesus' Proclamation of the Kingdom of God by Johannes Weiss, historical critical scholar. This is not a devotional book. But Weiss brought back something that 19th century German liberalism had entirely done away with, and that's the theme of apocalyptic. You see, for the 19th century German liberal, Jesus was Mr. Nice Guy. He was Mr. Clean. He was Mr. Good Guy. He was, how do I want to put this with regard to them? I mean, I've already told you that quip of Cadbury's that all these lives of Jesus are just the lives of the writers written over Jesus. They're just seeing themselves in Jesus and writing about themselves. They had entirely gutted, as it were, any radicality on the part of Jesus. And Weiss brought that back in when he says Jesus' understanding of the kingdom of God is that it's coming now, it's here, and people got to make decisions for it because, you know, the poop's going to hit the fan. And that's Weiss. Schweitzer would come along in his quest of the historical Jesus and chronicle this German lives of Jesus that had just book after book. In fact, it said when Schweitzer was writing this book in his study, the books were piled so high that he had little paths, you know, to get to where he had to go. He read massive amounts for this research project. I mean, still, I could never dream of reading that much on something. I'd kill myself. But he reads massive amounts, and he ends up showing the absolute failure of the quest for the historical Jesus. It's a failure. It's an utter failure. There is no historical Jesus. It's all a fantasy. It's the Jesus that really exists, according to Schweitzer, will throw himself on the wheel of history and in the process get crushed, and now he just rotates around the wheel of history, and we all live with this. That doesn't mean that Schweitzer doesn't also say Jesus comes to us as a stranger. He has this wonderful paragraph at the end of The Quest of the Historical Jesus. Just brilliant book. Brilliant quote. At any rate, this apocalyptic opening, this emphasis here is occurring at the same time as we're moving into World War I. Now remember, the 19th century is huge on optimism. Everything's optimistic. Everything's getting better. The Industrial Revolution, we're producing wealth. We're producing, you know, a strong merchant class. We're producing serious wealth as well. I mean, you move into the 20th century, we've got the telephone, we've got the automobile, the aeroplane, we've got, you know, Jules Verne thinking outside the box, stuff that we've done now, right? So you have this massive optimism, and in World War I, the Great War was what it was called, the Great War. There was the Great War, World War II, and then we're waiting for the apocalypse. That's the third one. Everything comes in threes, people. Yeah, so that's kind of a joke, kind of. Anyway, with this apocalyptic event of the Great War, and people like Schweitzer and Weiss just decimating the entire historical critical life of Jesus project. You can see why when Barth saw Adolf Harnack's signature on the Kulturkampf, the German culture domination project of Kaiser Wilhelm II, he sees this eminent theologian's name on there and realizes liberalism leads to this. It leads to this. And it's a dead end. It's a dead end. And we have to learn to read the Bible in a new way. And you've never read anything more exciting than the letters Karl Barth exchanges with Edward Ternyson, his pastor friend down the road by bicycle. That's how they got back and forth. And Barth is rediscovering Paul and Calvin. It's an amazing book of letters. And you can see that Barth recognizes that there has to be this very clear break with German liberalism, but it cannot be just going back into conservatism either. That doesn't work. That's not a workable model for him, but, he notes, it's a better model of how to do theology than that offered by liberalism. The model. Barth will take the model and change the contents and finesse the model so that it's much more integrative and beautiful. You'll take that Protestant Orthodox model and kind of just move some pieces around and make it beautiful. But the liberal model doesn't work. Same reason that he has to move pieces around in the Protestant Orthodox model. This argument with the right, the conservatives, was their apologetics. They spent all of their time trying to prove that their interpretations of things were correct. That's all they did, was sit and just justify. Apologetics. Barth felt the gospel needed no defense because God needed no defense. And Barth understood early on that only God is God. End of story. We're not God. And we can't discover God, we can't find God, we can't create God, we can't climb a ladder to God. We are in the dark. End of story. Barth, like Paul, like Augustine, like Calvin, had a robust doctrine of original sin, which is essential. When you don't have a robust doctrine of original sin, you don't need a savior. You don't need revelation. When you don't have a robust doctrine of original sin, when you're unwilling to acknowledge that this whole thing, this whole project that you exist in that's called culture, space, time, human history, your life, it's an illusion. Because the ego is a social construct. It's not real. There has to be the recreation of the self and the new story where the ego becomes integrated with the self. That's stuff I'm doing over in the grandfather group, the spirituality side of this. When Barth is making this discovery, let God be God, he writes these extraordinary, powerful essays. Again, you want to read something that will just rock your world, and you're willing to understand that what Barth's saying about his new reading of the Bible and the old way of reading the Bible, Barth's made some kind of radical break. What is that radical break? Well, at this stage in the game, that is in the years, say, from 1915 through the early to mid 1920s, for Barth, this is a dialectic break. It's that kind of thesis and then Barth, antithesis, bam. It's that Kierkegaardian dialectic, and Barth will insist over and over again, both sides of the dialectic come into play. So with this radical reading of Paul that he's going to do, where as he comes, for example, to the discussion of the law, Barth sees that as religion in general. And Paul's critique of Torah is Paul's critique of all religion. It's a very Girardian move all the way back then, you see. Okay? Interestingly enough, in Girard's home, in his library, he only had a small section of books on Barth, and one was the commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. I did ask him at one point about Barth's influence on him, and he said, "Oh, I read some stuff, and he said I read some books, but mostly I read von Balthasar, Hans-Urs von Balthasar's book, The Theology of Karl Barth." So it's not like Barth had a lot of influence, but Rene was aware of him, and certainly had a copy of this Roma brief. For historical sake, you need to know there's a big difference between the first edition of Karl Barth's Romans, which you're reading about in the letters. That's the explosive volume. Carl Adam, I believe, the Catholic theologian, called it a bomb on the theologian's playground. And then the second and through the sixth editions, it goes through a major transformation. And if you read it in English now, you're reading the second edition, okay, the second through the sixth editions. Just preface changes mostly. But that first edition, man, it was explosive. So here's a story that will help you kind of understand now this Bart Bultmann thing that's going to happen in the 1940s, because these two books by Schweitzer and Weiss would shift the scene so that Bart and Bultmann can make this break with liberalism, even though Bart will eventually see from his perspective. Of course, Bultmann hasn't made the break. Nevertheless, this story will illustrate the difference between Bart and Bultmann. And originally, the tale it's an apocryphal tale, of course. It's just an illustration. Is between Bart and Tillich. So if you know anything about Paul Tillich, you'll laugh doubly when I substitute Bultmann in there for Tillich in the story. So Bart and Bultmann are walking the streets of Jerusalem together, and they're discussing the incarnation and, you know, all the theological things that go with that, and the metaphysics and the problems with it. And of course, you have Bultmann saying it doesn't really matter. You know, it works better with Tillich. It really works better with Tillich, because Bultmann wouldn't quite go far. I think Bultmann would want some historical Jesus, but Tillich, no, Christ is a symbol, you know. But at any rate, Bultmann is just articulating the symbolism here of the narratives of the birth and the resurrection and on and on. And they pass the church where Jesus is born. That's over there, the Church of the Nativity. And there's a Latin phrase inscribed across the top of the arch. It says, hic vero caro factum est, I believe it is. Here, the word was made flesh, and the Latin word for here is hic, okay? So Bart looks up at Bultmann and says, but you see, Rudolph, I have to have my hic. I have to have that historicity, that time and space thing, this really event happened kind of thing. Well, when you look at modern liberalism today, folks, really you see something very similar. Things just don't change. Jesus is a symbol or a cipher for a lot of liberalism. New Age speculators, garbage scholarship. Jesus is a symbol or a cipher. And that is entirely the wrong way to approach the figure of Jesus. And it's certainly a very poor approach to the Gospels and the question of historicity and other kinds of things. But let's maintain this. So far, up until World War I, the entire historical critical project with reference to the life of Jesus from the perspective of Schweitzer and Weiss and Bart and Bultmann ended in utter failure. Now there's going to come a reboot of the historical critical method in the 1950s, brought about somewhat by American scholarship and British scholarship, which British scholarship is always going to be much more level-headed. German scholarship is going to be much more adventurous, and American scholarship tends to be much more speculative. So you have three types of scholarship, okay, and there really are. You can see the difference in the educational systems, okay. But as we have this shift into this rejection of the historical critical method up to this point applied to the life of Jesus, because really all it does in the name of science is allow the scholar to project themselves into the gospel text and produce themselves. Oddly enough, and this is how history is so strange to me. And we'll get back to, I see this, got this one little curly hair there driving me back crazy. Okay, there we go. We'll get back to the 20s and 30s, because the Bart Bonhoeffer interaction here, the the whole issue in and around the shifts in American Christianity, British Christianity, and German Christianity after the war. Well, at any rate, one of the things that will happen is that the 40s and 50s, it's the two granddaddies of theology that dominate the theological scene, Barth and Bultmann. Yeah, you had Tillich kind of, yeah, you had Niebuhr kind of, and Bonhoeffer had not yet really been discovered until the late 50s. I mean, Dieter Zimmermann is producing, or publishing, I should say, in a post World War II, I believe it was 47, 48 already. He's producing some of the letters and papers from prison and ethics that Eberhard Beke is funneling his way. But of course, Bonhoeffer doesn't really get discovered until the late 50s and then the 60s, and with John A.T. Robertson's misuse of him and William Hamilton's creative misuse of him too. And then, of course, Bonhoeffer studies really emerged full flower in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they've diminished somewhat this last 20 years. Metaxas, if you have Eric Metaxas' book on Bonhoeffer in your library, it's probably the only book I'll ever tell you to just throw away or burn, unless you really want to keep it to show people how poorly a book can be written. It's probably the best example of a poorly written book that I know of, Eric Metaxas' biography on Bonhoeffer. Okay, in the United States, however, you have the great debates between Barth and Bultmann on Bultmann's side. There are three things that are going to shift following World War II. One is the rise of the ecumenical movement. Okay, churches are going to realize we got to talk, right? We've just been killing each other. We got to talk. Okay, so the ecumenical movement, 50s, 60s, 70s, big, and then the interfaith movement exploded after that, and the ecumenical movement died. But in the 40s, 50s, you also had the repercussions of the results of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library. Bam! Things are going to be changing. But more than that, you had for the first time Christian scholars engaging Jewish scholars in Second Temple Judaism. And Christian scholars began learning from Jewish scholars how to think like a Jew, not like a Christian, when it came to reading Jewish literature. That has produced magnificent results, more than anything else since the 1950s. More than theology, more than anything else, has been the incredible scholarship in Second Temple Judaism. That, I mean, gosh, if I was a young lad today, I would pick up right there and run in that discipline. It's just incredible. But you have these explosions in the 40s and 50s, these theological explosions, and the granddaddies are back and forth in their books with each other, and you have Bultmann students and you have Barth students, okay? Now, some of Bultmann's students are going to depart from the master's thinking. Ernst Käsemann, Günter Bornkamm, and they would begin the second quest for the historical Jesus. And we're now in the so-called third quest, or some say we're beyond the third quest, or they just keep searching. Yeah. Again, it's not that there isn't good stuff that can't be gleaned from that, but there's not a biography of Jesus. You can't produce it. That's why, for me, John Dominic Crossan's book on Jesus fails. It ultimately fails. N.T. Wright's Jesus and the Victory of God is close. It's okay. It's better, but it's still sacrificial at points. But Wright does really move in quite a direction away from the sacrificial in that volume, which is why I do delight in it. But in America, and this is interesting, in America, remember, post-World War II, it's the major universities and their divinity faculties, Duke, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, they're the major producers of scholarship. But following World War II, these centers are going to be influenced more by Bultmann than Barth. Princeton is the exception, but Yale and Harvard both go the Bultmannian route, and then as well does the Claremont School of Theology in LA and other significant theological centers. Barth becomes almost an afterthought for Christian theology from the 1960s, and Bultmann and the new hermeneutic that comes from the Bultmann students, particularly Ernst Fuchs and Gerhard Ebeling, in the 1960s. Here is Bultmann's influence in America, and it's Bultmann's influence in America that's dominated the emerging religion departments in the last 40 years in the United States. Okay? The granddaddies are battling it out in the 50s. Barth never really wins, except amongst Barthians. Because it's so much more convenient and easier to believe that with this noodle, I can figure God out. And if I can't, then that part of God or that God doesn't exist. But this noodle's going to tell me right and wrong, truth and error. Okay? This is where a robust doctrine of original sin counts, people. This thing doesn't work. It doesn't work. Do you understand me? This ego, this self-consciousness, this I, it doesn't work. It's broke. It's broke. That's the problem with liberalism. It doesn't recognize that. And it has no spirituality to correct it. There's no way to correct it because you can't get from here to revelation. Revelation comes from God. End of story. God reveals God's self. God reveals God's self, and God reveals God's self. That's Barth. That's your doctrine of the Trinity. God reveals God's self. God reveals, that's Christ, God's self. God reveals God's self. That's the Spirit. I know some of you Barthians are looking at me funny, but think it through. It works. I'm at 32 minutes. I think what I want to do, instead of carrying on with the notes here, is I want to just carry on with this observation I'm making right now with one of my students. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Since the 12th century, the church has been wrestling with the most singular issue of the relationship between reason and revelation, and it has not been able to find its way out. It can't. It just can't do it. It's impossible. Sometimes people are fond of saying, well, you know, the Eastern Church has Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote, you know, all these wonderful treatises about the limitations of language and apophatic theology and how God is to be found in not statements and the negative of you know, and so, you know, well, that's really great for postmoderns and stuff. They love that stuff because they think, you know, you can't talk about God. You know, God is like, okay, that was God, but I can't name it, you know. They love all that ooey gooey stuff because it makes them feel superior. They had some experience. They feel superior. That's not what Dionysius the Areopagite is saying when it comes to the relationship of language to God. If you really want to understand Dionysius the Areopagite, you almost got to read Wittgenstein. You know, they have a very similar view of the relationship of language to reality, if you can use that word. Modern philosophy hates that word, reality. Hates it. Hates to acknowledge that there's actually something out there. All right. So here we are, stuck in 21st century medieval Christianity. Do we not all deal with the problem of the law? Have we not been dealing with that all our Christian lives? Same thing Luther did. Have we not all been looking for a gracious God, a God that was really kind? That was Luther's question. How do we interpret the Bible? It just seems like everywhere we go in the church, we just see this interpretation that does nothing but support the church. There's no gospel in it. There's no good news in it. That was Calvin's question. How do we live this thing? Because, man, the world sucks. And if people are coming after me, yeah, I can love them, you know, but I'm going to kill them if they come after me or my family. How do we do this? How do we do this? The Anabaptists said, let's live this. See, all the traditions, they have this piece But none of them have brought it all together. So that you have, as I said in Theological Musings the last few weeks, who he is, what he says, what he does are all the same. This break, I'm going to shift now back, this break with the misused historical critical method up to that time, the taming, in a sense, of the historical critical method in particularly evangelical circles. I think evangelicals have done a good service in calling out the bullshit of a lot of the historical critical scholarship. Just bullshit it is. Speculation, just insane stuff. And they've helped tame it. But we're at a place now where we can no longer afford to think strictly in terms of the dichotomy that's been given us for the last 1,000 years. Okay? We haven't been able to find an answer or a solution, and we've just ended up killing each other from the 30 Years' War after the Reformation to World War II to Iraq, Afghanistan, and everywhere else in between. The church, as beautiful a concept of an institutional concept she may be, the church, as wonderful an idea as the bride of Christ may be, the church as the mother of the gospel has failed the world, except for keeping the gospel alive. That she's done. That she's done, and we're there. When you read anybody, any book, what you're looking for, if you really want to think like Tom Torrance, Karl Barth, Doug Campbell, myself, Athanasius, Albert Einstein, whoever, if you want to think in these, Rene Girard, if you want to think in these terms, when you read an author, what you're looking for is whether or not, A, they engage in apologetics. That indicates they're conservative, they have a foundation that they have to defend, something they have to defend, or whether the authors engage in the use of the analogy of being, which means I can take anything from here and reason my way to God. Let me give you an example. We do it when we talk about God is good. Well, how is God good? Well, God is good to the nth level of goodness, the ultimate goodness. Whatever the ultimate goodness is, but we see we already start with the definition of good. We don't allow God to give us the definition of good. We start with the definition of good. That's a foundation. It's a definition. And when you start there, you have the analogy of being. And you are simply taking yourself and projecting it onto the divine. Is when you acknowledge that you cannot come to these insights and truths on your own, that God must reveal them to you, that you are incapable of figuring out things. When you recognize that, when you are humble, that's the humble attitude Barth talks about in theology. When you are humble, then truth is revealed. I'll say it. I'll be bold. I have no problem with it. I'm postmodern, man. I'm postmodern. Humans are weird. They truly are. And theologians and biblical scholars and pastors and everybody else who plays with the Bible, I just look at them. I wonder, do you really have any idea what you're touching here when you touch this message, man? This is God. Okay, I'm going to take a break here at this point. I'll say good morning to everybody. I see Janice Olson's here and Christopher, Steve Martin. Hey, Steve, you going to be in town, Steve Martin? You going to be in town again? We got to hang out. Michelle, good morning. All right, so I will leave that here, let you ponder on that. and I'll continue this. I want to really help gut this out so you can not only get a kind of a feel for 20th century theology and biblical studies, which is one of my goals, is to get you the names and figures and movements, and we'll talk about all kinds of things, but to help zero in on the singular issue that's been plaguing Christendom since Islam introduced Aristotle into the West. I mean, it had its own issues before that. Believe me, it had its issues before that. I do not exactly see a healthy model of the relationship of reason to revelation in the Eastern Church, which is Platonic. I don't think Plato and Neoplatonism and the use of those categories in the Eastern Church has solved the problem. It hasn't. It certainly hasn't. Okay. But the introduction of Aristotle into the West created problems that we simply are finally starting to move away from. So thank you to Chuck Derrida for nailing the hammer, for hammering the nails in the coffin of modern philosophy. Carry on. We can go now in a better direction. Not Derrida's, obviously, because he's just the gravedigger. We're those who look for resurrection in cemeteries and find it. I'll leave you.